good to see you.
Hi,
And
hi,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah, and please,
Thank you, Dr. Nidhi.
you,
Can I start?
yeah, please.
Yeah, my slides are visible and I hope they are moving as well.
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Right.
thank you. So, the role given to me is the role of myeloid growth factors, and that is, I think there's nothing new about myeloid growth factors that we have learned in the past, and I think it's just a repetition of the old things. But yes, as Dr. Jyoti said, uh, supportive care is very important, and as we proceed in oncology, I think the newer additions have been around targeted therapies where myeloid suppression is not very common, but chemotherapy stays in. And therefore, we do find a lot of immunosuppression. There was a time when we used to be very wary of using myeloid growth factors, but as the cost of myeloid growth factors have declined and the confidence on myeloid growth factors have increased, the incidence of febrile neutropenia has drastically decreased. So let's see what is there in the offing, and so I'll just discuss about the guidelines around the use of myeloid growth factors as far as NCCN guideline goes, and then I'll discuss about please. Then I'll discuss about the 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 molecule of MCure, that is MCRAST-M, and whether it has anything different to offer. So we know that regulation of hematopoiesis goes through common myeloid progenitor cells or through a multipotential hematopoietic stem cell, which differentiates into megakaryocytes, erythrocytes, and myeloblasts. And among the myeloblasts, neutrophils being the most common and the most important, where GCSF works. But if you look at GM-CSF works all throughout, including megakaryocytes, including erythrocyte lineage, and including the myeloblast. And the GM-CSF also works on neutrophils, but also increases the monocyte concentration. So it is a pan proliferator index where GM-CSF works everywhere, whereas GCSF works only on the neutrophilic lineage. We know that there are the CTC criteria is very well laid out as far as hematological adverse events are concerned, and we know that there's different criteria of different grades of toxicities which we face during the chemotherapy-induced hematological adverse events, and we are quite well versed with the neutropenia and the grading of neutropenia, and we know that anything which is less than lower limit of normal up to 1500 is graded as grade 1, and the grade 2 is 1500 to 1000, and 1000 to 500 is grade 3, and anything less than 500 absolute neutrophil count is grade 4. And if this is coupled with the febrile neutropenia, it is considered a life-threatening, potentially life-threatening consequence of chemotherapy. The definition of febrile neutropenia is defined as a single temperature of more than 38.3 degree Celsius orally, or more than 38 degree Celsius for 1 hour, with a neutropenia of less than 500, or a neutrophil count, absolute neutrophil count of less than 1000, and a predicted decline of less than 500 over the next 48 hours. So I think we all, as medical oncologists, are quite well versed with that. And we know that neutropenia can result into febrile neutropenia, which can lead on to sepsis and prolonged hospital stay, and potentially is life-threatening and can cause death as well. In management of neutropenia is concerned, we always gravitate to the NCCN guidelines. So in case a patient is receiving chemotherapy which has a high potential to have neutropenia, and the potential is marked as high, is marked as more than 20% chance of febrile neutropenia or neutropenia in severe neutropenia with a set protocol, set chemotherapy protocol, GM-CSF or GCSF is very much indicated. In case there is intermediate risk, that is 10 to 20% chance of neutropenia, the guidelines say that one should consider GCSF based on patient risk factors. But if it is low, then there is no need to use GCSF. Among the patient factors are if the patient has received prior chemotherapy or radiation therapy, has had persistent neutropenia already, there is bone marrow involvement of the tumor, or has had recent surgery or open wounds, liver or renal dysfunction is there, or the age is more than 65 years, where full chemotherapy is used, and especially in curative settings where you would not like to decrease the doses of chemotherapy so that the patient can withstand chemotherapy. In such cases, the patient should be considered, even if the risk is intermediate, one should consider use of prophylactic GCSF. In case the patient has had a neutropenic episode and one has used GCSF, and despite that the patient encountered a febrile neutropenia, then a dose reduction is warranted in the second and future cycles. In case the patient has not received GCSF, one can continue with the same dosage and consider GCSF in the subsequent cycles. Uh, Whereas in a patient who has not had any dose limiting toxicity or neutropenic event, one can just continue with the same cycles. In case the patient just land up in neutropenia and has received GCSF and it was a short-acting GCSF such as a filgrastim, one can continue using GCSF throughout the febrile neutropenia phase till the counts increase. And if the patient has received a long-acting filgrastim, there's no use of giving any additional GCSF. But I think in practice, we understand that sometimes these PEG GCSF and are not preserved well, or the cold chain is broken, and we do tend to use GCSF still, even if they have received PEG GCSF and they have had a severe neutropenia. We do intend to use GCSF in that setting. So I don't really, go by this particular management guidelines, because our Indian specific guidelines should be slightly different, and that is what I feel. Um, Patients who have not received any GCSF and have had a low risk chemotherapy protocol, and the expected there's no expectation of a severe complication, one may avoid myeloid growth factors. But I think in most of the instances one would like to use it, because the cost of GCSF in our country is very, very cheap, and I think it's not very wise to keep the patient in neutropenia and waiting for a complication to occur. So one is free to use myeloid growth factors, but although the guidelines feel that if one does not anticipate any complication, one may avoid using myeloid growth factors. These are the various high-risk febrile neutropenia causing chemotherapy protocols, such as BEAR-COOP or dose-dense chemotherapy or dose-dense chemotherapy for bladder cancer or breast cancer. These are high risk for neutropenia. Any chemotherapy, such as which includes docetaxel, is considered as intermediate to high risk for neutropenia. Also, like chemotherapy such as triple drug combinations for colorectal cancer, such as FOLFOXIRI, or a TPF for head and neck cancer, or esophageal or stomach cancer, is also considered high risk for neutropenia, including single agent docetaxel and topotecan are also considered high risk for neutropenia. Soft tissue sarcoma protocols are also considered high risk, as is also the triple chemotherapy protocols for testicular cancer, such as PIP and VIP, are considered high risk. Other tumors, such as gemdocetaxel for occult primary or for sarcoma, are considered intermediate risk, and I think in most of the instances one would like to use GCSF. Carboplatin paclitaxel is considered intermediate risk, and sometimes we do use growth factor support in these patients, depending on the patient risk factors. And even cabazitaxel and carboplatin etoposide for small cell carcinoma, BEP, they are all considered intermediate risk. CHOP chemotherapy for lymphoma is considered intermediate risk, and one may consider using GCSF in these patients based on patient practice. Usually, this can be given from the next day onwards, and PEG GCSF, which is PEG filgrastim, that can be given from next day, and generally it should not be used in a patient who is on a weekly regime, where it is not recommended. That means after PEG GCSF, one should not give chemotherapy for at least 12 days. There should be a gap of at least 12 days after giving PEG GCSF in the subsequent cycles of chemotherapy. Subcutaneous route is the preferred route of giving any GCSF. Now, coming to the clinical data on GM-CSF, which is one of the one of the major molecules of MCure. So, as I said, that GM-CSF works on not only neutrophils but also macrophages and also dendritic cells. So, the red ring over here denotes where GM-CSF works. So, it works not only on megakaryocytes, on erythrocytes, it works on neutrophils, eosinophil macrophages, as also myeloid-related dendritic cells and the interaction over there. So GM-CSF links innate and adaptive immunity by inducing growth and maturation of antigen-presenting myeloid-derived dendritic cells as well. So it has a more broad-based action as compared to GCSF alone. So these are the differences between GCSF and GMCSF. The GMCSF does enhance chemotaxis and phagocytosis and antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity which is in addition to what is delivered by filgrastim. It's a monomeric glycoprotein secreted by the macrophages, T cell and mast cells, and natural killer cells and endothelial cells that function as a cytokine. And the GMCSF is called as cerebramostin. And unlike GCSF, which specifically promotes only neutrophil proliferation and maturation, GMCSF affects many more cells, especially macrophages and eosinophils. If you look at the indications of cerebramostin, it is basically meant for AML, to allow hematopoietic stem cell mobilization for autologous stem cell transplantation, for myeloid reconstitution after an autologous stem cell transplant. It is also indicated for allogenic stem cell transplant and also for delayed neutrophil recovery or graft failure after autologous or allogenic stem cell transplantation. And patients who are more than 17 years of age who have had myelosuppressive doses of radiation, in these patients it is indicated, not specifically chemotherapy-induced neutropenia in adult patients. The dose is 250 microgram per meter square. It is available as a 500 microgram vial, and generally the entire vial is used, although the dose is 250 microgram per meter square per day. So there is limited comparative data between GCSF and GMCSF. There's only one randomized trial directly comparing GCSF and GMCSF in 181 afebrile cancer patient undergoing myelosuppressive chemotherapy. And the patient receiving GCSF had a 1 day shorter time to recovery from neutropenia, but the difference was neither clinically or statistically significant. So the comparative data between cerebramostin and filgrastim in the treatment of chemotherapy-induced neutropenia, well, the prospective study compared the efficacy and toxicity among the patient who received cerebramostin and who received filgrastim. The results showed that they are mainly equivalent and there is interchangeable between hospitalized patients with chemotherapy-induced neutropenia. However, there is one interesting study which I find very interesting, is which is published in International Journal of Basic and Clinical Pharmacology, where the study assesses the therapeutic role of GMCSF on augmentation of total leukocyte count and also total platelet count in cancer patients after chemotherapy. So it does show that it not only augments total leukocyte count, but also total platelet count. Many times patients who land up with chemotherapy-induced bone marrow suppression will have low platelet counts as well as low TLC count. And sometimes when we give GCSF to them, there is further decrease in the platelet count. Whereas in this particular study, very interestingly, the total leukocyte count also increased, as also the total platelet count, which increased. So if you have biocytopenias, perhaps GMCSF is something which can be considered. So if you look at the blue bar is the TLC before giving GMCSF and the TLC after giving GMCSF, we see that in almost all the 29, 30 odd patients, there was an increase in the TLC after giving the GMCSF. But not only this, even the platelet count, the total platelet count also seemed to increase and not decrease, which is so very true with GCSF. The total platelet count also increased in almost all the 30 odd patients in this particular study, where the total platelet count after giving MGRAST-M was better with as compared to GCSF, as compared to what we see with GCSF. So GMCSF has a therapeutic role in the enhancement of not only platelet count and not only leukocyte count, but also platelet count in patients receiving cancer chemotherapy. And so the primary indications also, although does not allow us, but wherever I think one is stuck with a low platelet count in addition to low neutrophil count, this is one thing which definitely amuses me. And the route of administration is subcutaneous or IV. And this is similar between filgrastim, pegfilgrastim, and cerebramostin. The half-life is about 3.5 hours with filgrastim, which is 60 minutes to 2.7 hours with subcutaneous route for cerebramostin, and it is about 15 to 80 hours with pegfilgrastim. So to summarize, colony-stimulating factors have been widely evaluated and assessed, and they minimize the extent and duration of neutropenia associated with myelosuppressive cytotoxic chemotherapy or radiation therapy, and it is also used for conditions other than acute leukemia and myelodysplastic syndrome, and in the setting of hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. And despite their effects on neutropenia, prophylactic GCSF has not really shown to impact survival, but I think in our setting, it has definitely resulted into avoiding many hospitalizations for febrile neutropenia and shortening the duration of febrile neutropenia and enhancing or at least rapiditating the recovery of patients. With that, I thank you, and over to the chairperson.
Dr. Manish, it was a lucid and very nice presentation. It was and concentrating a bit on the GMCSF helps everybody. I really feel very good about that. And we know in 2000 only 30% of patients would get growth factor, the GCSF or GMCSF, mainly GCSF. In 2010, maybe more than 50%. And now in 2020, I'm sure 80% of patients must be getting the growth factor. So I think the value has improved and increased.
Yes,
and I do agree that, it's very important supportive care, which has made our treatment as an outpatient and less admissions. This is open for any questions from the audience we can take. If not, then should we move to next one?
Yeah, I think maybe we can discuss the questions in the panel discussion and towards the end. So so maybe we can move ahead and our eminent chairpersons do not really need a formal introduction, but as the custom and for the flow, I just want to formally introduce again, Madam, to Dr. Asha Kapadia, who is one of the pioneer in medical oncology in Indian context, and she is at present the head of the department and a very senior medical oncologist at P.D. Hinduja National Hospital Research Center. Our another chairperson is Dr. Subramanian, who is again head of the department and very senior medical oncologist at BS Hospital, Chennai. So further on, all the proceedings will be taken care by the eminent chairperson. So, Madam, please move ahead for the next speaker.
Yeah, let my co-chair introduce the next person.
Good evening, all of you. Supportive care is an important component of cancer management. And we are now going to the next topic, the management of CINU, that is chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. This talk is going to be given by Dr. Jyoti Vatra. She is Associate Director of Medical Oncology and Hemato-Oncology of the Medanta Cancer Institute, Delhi. Dr. Jyoti Vatra.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, all. I'm going to talk to you today about management of chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Now, chemotherapy-induced nausea vomiting is in fact the most feared side effect of chemotherapy. And if we talk of patients' perception, they in fact rank severe CINV near death. So it's that sinister. So these are the two most frequent and troubling side effects that patients can experience during chemotherapy, and they do interfere with the treatment compliance and the quality of life. Over the years, however, the treatment available to control nausea vomiting has improved significantly. However, control of anticipatory and delayed nausea vomiting still remains a significant problem. The causation of nausea vomiting induced by chemotherapy is multifactorial and is often very complicated. And there are different pathways that are involved, and they involve multiple neurotransmitters and their receptors. The CINV can be classified into 5 subtypes. The acute nausea vomiting, which occurs within a few minutes to up to 12 hours after chemotherapy. Delayed one, which occurs beyond 24 hours. anticipatory, which in fact occurs before a cycle of chemotherapy as part of a conditioned response. It could also be breakthrough nausea vomiting, which occurs despite the preventive measures, and it could be refractory in some cases. And all these different classifications, the different types require different measures to manage them. Now, why is it so crucial to effectively control this CINV? It's very important because if left uncontrolled, it can lead to dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. It can also result in muscular effects, can result in malnutrition and esophageal tears. It can ultimately impair the health-related quality of life in cancer patients. It can sometimes result in discontinuation of the ongoing treatment, which can result ultimately in increase in morbidity and mortality due to cancer. It can result in the delay in discharge from the hospital and can ultimately increase the cost to the healthcare system. It's very important to be also aware of the various risk factors which could be patient-related or treatment-related, which increase the risk of someone getting CINV. So if the patient is young, has susceptibility to motion sickness, has experienced CINV earlier, or is anxious, or has had emesis gravidarum, has impaired performance status, such a patient would be more at risk of CINV. There are different chemotherapy drugs with different emetogenic potential, which would affect the risk of CINV. Their dose and schedule would also affect the CINV. So it's very important to tailor the CINV treatment to keeping in mind these risk factors as well. Now, the chemotherapy drugs are classified into these 4 emetic risk groups: high, wherein the risk of CINV is greater than 90%. It could be moderate, wherein the risk is 30 to 90%. Low, if it's between 10 to 30%, and minimal emetogenic potential if the risk of CINV is less than 10%. And we have various classifications, and the drugs that are said to be having high emetic potential are enumerated here on this slide. And just to point of view, cisplatin, carboplatin, when used in the dose of AUC more than 4, the AC as is used in breast cancer treatment, they're all said to have high emetic potential. Moderate emetogenic potential is with the carboplatin in the dose less than 4 AUC, cyclophosphamide, oxaliplatin. These are the common drugs that we use with moderate emetic potential. Low emetogenic potential is said to be of taxanes and gemcitabine predominantly. And there are drugs such as vinca alkaloids which have minimal emetic potential. So it's very important to be aware. And similarly, we have classified the oral anti-cancer drugs also into those with moderate to high emetic potential and those with minimal or low emetic potential. For effectively managing the CINV, it's very important to be aware of the problem, the risk factors, as I have already enumerated, to know the emetogenic potential of the drug in use. And it's also very important to understand the pathophysiology behind the CINV. Talking about it briefly, we know that there are central mechanisms involving the chemoreceptor trigger zone, and there are peripheral mechanisms, and they both are in fact interdependent and interrelated. There are various neurotransmitters involved in this process, and this slide lists all those neurotransmitters. Most predominant among these are the serotonin, substance P, endorphins, histamine, dopamine, and acetylcholine. Now, we have different anti-MSS guidelines, namely the NCCN, ASCO, ESMO, and the Multinational Association of Supportive Care in Cancer. And my talk is based on these guidelines. Now, let's start in the reverse order. So if we are using a drug which has minimal emetogenic potential, no routine prophylaxis is warranted. If the drug has low emetic potential, one could use either steroid dexamethasone or metoclopramide or chlorperazine or a single 5-HT3 receptor antagonist. And this is also the same guidelines are issued by MASCC and ESMO as well, that minimally emetogenic chemotherapy does not warrant any prophylaxis. And low one warrants use of a single drug, either steroid, dexamethasone, or 5-HT3 receptor antagonist, or dopamine receptor antagonist such as metoclopramide. If we are worried about the delayed nausea vomiting in such a case with low or minimally emetogenic chemotherapy, actually nothing more needs to be done in addition. Coming to the moderate emetic potential chemotherapy drugs, for prevention of acute nausea vomiting, it is recommended that we combine a 5-HT3 receptor antagonist with dexamethasone. And for taking care of the delayed nausea vomiting due to moderately emetogenic chemotherapy, one can use dexamethasone on day 2 and 3 as well. Now, coming to the group of high emetic risk category, it is all the guidelines recommend a 3-drug regime, which consists of single dose of 5-HT3 receptor antagonist, dexamethasone, and neurokinin receptor antagonist. Any one of them given before chemo. Now, talking about the NK1 receptor antagonist, we have various forms available like aprepitant, fosaprepitant in the IV form, netivepitant, and rolapitant. The netivepitant is often administered in a fixed dose formulation. It's available in combination with paltusotine, and this is very convenient and very effective antiemetic. To prevent the delayed nausea vomiting due to non-AC chemotherapy of high emetic risk, again, a 3-drug combination regime, as I've already highlighted, is recommended. In addition, dexamethasone is to be continued from day 2 to 4 to take care of the delayed nausea and vomiting. Now, for prevention of acute nausea vomiting due to AC-based chemotherapy, as in breast cancer, because this is said to have high emetic potential, again, a 3-drug regime, as already enumerated, is to be used. And for prevention of delayed nausea vomiting due to this, again, one will continue dexamethasone on day 2 and 3. And obviously, if aprepitant has been used, you will continue that also on day 2 and 3. However, if netivepitant or fosaprepitant have been used on day 1, then nothing more needs to be done. Olanzapine is a very important adjunct to the treatment to take care of the delayed nausea and vomiting due to these drugs with high emetic potential. Now, what about patients who are receiving multiple days cisplatin? Again, it's recommended that these patients should receive 5-HT3 receptor antagonist and dexamethasone and aprepitant. And obviously, such a patient would get aprepitant on day 2 and 3 as well. What about those patients who are receiving high-dose chemotherapy prior to stem cell transplant? It is recommended to use a combination of 5-HT3 receptor antagonists with dexamethasone and aprepitant in this group of patients. What about breakthrough treatment, breakthrough nausea vomiting? The general principle that is recommended is to add another agent from a different class of drugs to the current ongoing regime. So one could use olanzapine, or one could add benzodiazepines such as lorazepam. One could also use drugs like metoclopramide or haloperidol. And there is some controversy about the use of cannabinoids, and I'll come to it shortly. For the prevention of anticipatory nausea and vomiting, the best approach is to prevent acute nausea. It's very important to prevent and control acute nausea vomiting to prevent anticipatory nausea and vomiting. And in addition to these drug measures, various behavioral therapies are also recommended, such as relaxation, hypnosis, guided imagery, music therapy, yoga, acupuncture or acupressure, etc. And also the use of anxiolytics to take care of the anticipatory nausea and vomiting. This slide shows the recommended doses, keeping in view mainly the cardiac side effects, QTc prolongation, which is possible due to this class of drugs, 5-HT3 receptor antagonists. So ondansetron, oral dose maximum 16 milligrams is recommended, IV. And palonosetron, when used in IV formulation, 0.25 milligrams, and in oral, 0.5 milligrams. The recommended doses for dexamethasone depend on the emetogenic potential of the chemotherapy. If it's high risk, One could use 20 milligrams once, or to take care of the delayed one, 8 milligrams twice a day, continued over next 3 to 4 days is good enough. For moderate risk acute emesis, 8 milligrams once is good enough, and again continue for 2 to 3 days to take care of the delayed emesis. And low risk, one could reduce the dose to half. Coming to the recommended neurokinin 1 receptor antagonist dose, aprepitant, we all know, 125 milligrams on day 1 of the chemotherapy and 80 milligrams on day 2 and 3. And fosaprepitant is just given once on day 1 of the chemotherapy intravenously. And netipitant, as I've already mentioned, is available in fixed drug formation along with 0.5 milligrams of palonosetron, and only once before the chemo day of chemo is enough. So this slide summarizes the important international guidelines for control of acute nausea and vomiting, and triple drug regime or double drug regime, or even single agent or low emetic risk drugs. And for taking care of delayed nausea vomiting, it's very important to use drugs such as olanzapine. Now, what about if, despite all this, the patient has poorly controlled CINV? It's then important to exclude other factors, such as whether the patient is on opiate analgesics, is the patient on antibiotics such as erythromycin, has the patient developed CNS mets, or has gone into gastrointestinal obstruction, has the patient developed hypercalcemia, or is the patient also getting abdominopelvic radiotherapy? So one must look into all these factors as well. Now, other measures which may need to be undertaken is to adjust the regime that the patient has been on, and if not controlled on that, one could step up and one could use the higher risk group recommendations. Additionally, one could use benzodiazepines, olanzapine, or dopaminergic antagonists like haloperidol, or one could also substitute with high-dose intravenous metoclopramide. Now, rarely one may also need to alter the chemotherapy plan of the patient. However, one must keep in mind that one does not compromise the anti-tumor activity of the given treatment regime. So one could use single-day therapy instead of multiple-day protocols. One could also increase the infusion time to reduce the risk of CINV. What about marijuana and CBD oil? Now, because of the medical and legal concerns, the use of these drugs or agents is not recommended as yet for the management of CINV, and is currently not included in most recent guidelines. However, in that table that I showed of NCCN, it does list cannabinoids as one of the important adjunct measures. What about complementary therapies? So in 2018, ASCO did endorse the Society for Integrative Oncology evidence-based guideline for the use of various integrative therapies after breast cancer treatment, such as ginger in capsule form, acupressure, and electroacupuncture, in addition to antiemetic drugs to control nausea and vomiting during chemotherapy. Now, other non-pharmacological strategies which have also been studied and used occasionally to control CINV include cognitive distraction, systematic desensitization, exercise, hypnosis, and transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. Thus, to end my talk, I would want to emphasize that in the cancer management of a given patient with cancer, besides the medical, surgical, and radiation oncology components of the treatment, control of CINV is very, very important and must never be, underplayed or underemphasized, because this ultimately does affect the quality of life and does ensure the very good control of CINV, does ensure good compliance with the very important anti-cancer treatment. So I would end my talk here, and over to the chairpersons, please.
Dr. Jyoti,
Yes, Dr. Jyoti Wadhwa congratulations, Dr. Jyoti Wadhwa, for the excellent coverage of management of CINV. You have rightly emphasized the importance of control of CINV the management of cancer. You have covered all the aspects of it. I remember the days of 1971 when we started to make practice, when we used pop and mop therapy for the Hodgkins. We had only Logactil and Stamatil, and patients were really having severe problems. 79, when we started using platinum, which is one of the most hematogenic drugs, we didn't have proper drugs at the time. We were using metoclopramide and ampule every 2 hours, continuous 24 days, 24 hours. Now the situation's changed. Medical oncologists of recent years are really fortunate having effective anti-emetic therapy. Thank you for the excellent lecture. Thank you.
I think it's a very valid point you have made. There's these anti-emetic therapy has really did wonders, and fear of chemotherapy is really elevated because of these, anti-emetic regimens. I have one question for you, Dr. Jyoti Varma. What is your take on olanzapine? I also often feel it is an underused drug. Because of perhaps the sedation potential it is having. So, what is your personal experience and what you recommend from the literature?
So in my experience, I found it really useful. And regarding the dose recommended is 5 to 10 milligrams. However, I have never used 10 milligrams because from the literature it's apparent that that's quite sedating. So I've used 2.5 or 5 milligrams once a day, and it has been very effective in taking care of especially the delayed nausea. So I think olanzapine is underused, but is a very good drug.
Yeah, so absolutely. So in clinics, I want to make this point, emphasize this, that a very small dose like 2.5, even I use the 2.5 milligram dose, and it's often, we found it effective in our patients. Maybe their BSA and BMI is lower in comparison to the Western, counterparts. So that is also one of the reasons. At 10 milligram is too sedative. Even 5 milligrams, we are seeing troublesome sedation. So I think 2.5 is also a good dose when you are dealing with delayed nausea monitoring.
Yes.
Over to the chairpersons.
Thank you. Can unmute Dr. Asha Kapadias. Okay, we go to the third topic. It's going to be alopecia induced by chemotherapy. How do we prevent it? The talk is going to be given by Dr. Jyoti Vashpai. He's a senior medical oncologist, Tata Memorial Hospital, Mumbai. Dr. Jyoti.
Thank you very much, sir. And Kalpesh, can we have slides? Right. So, in next few minutes, we shall be talking about the scalp cooling for chemotherapy-induced alopecia prevention, and what are the myths and facts about the this therapy or this ancillary therapy, I would say. And I would like to begin with the notion that once upon a time, which was considered as a fantasy, is a reality today, and we will discuss about the background as well as our own original data from Tata Memorial Center. So chemotherapy-induced alopecia is not life-threatening, but it is one of the most visibly distressing adverse effect of chemotherapy. Clinicians often neglect alopecia owing to the fact that can be completely reversible. However, the time taken can be variable, and at times it doesn't resolve to normal at all. Obviously, the clinicians treating the cancer, they are focused more towards treating the disease. So they find that perhaps, as Madam was also mentioning in the beginning, and she was thinking this a decade or more than that before, that it is essentially a cosmetic thing which is not perceived very well by the majority of the country. They feel that we are treating a very harsh disease. Life is very much important, and these all factors should be sidelined, but perhaps a quality of life is also having equally important concerns. Next, please. So, what is the mechanism of action of scalp cooling? Next, please. So at any time point, around 85 to 90% of the hair follicles are in the rapidly dividing phase, and therefore they are prone to damage by chemotherapeutic agents. Next, scalp cooling essentially causes scalp vasoconstriction, and they reduces the follicular metabolic rate, resultant diminished cellular drug uptake. So, uh, this diminished chemotherapy delivery leading to potential increase in scalp metastasis was a concern for a long period of time, and that was one of the reasons that people were really reluctant to use it. However, the long-term safety data which is available now is aligned to this fear at least. Next, please. So, in the past, there were multiple attempts by various, mechanisms, by various techniques, and the wide variety of cooling techniques were used. Basic cryogel caps, which were the most ancient, the penguin caps, and the modern scalp cooling system. They are different, and success rate widely varied from 0 to 90%, which could be attributed to multiple cancer types being enrolled in the trials, varied chemotherapy regimens, intrinsic patient as well as hair characteristics, technical reasons like optimal cap fit, and it is very, very important. Even we see in our trial that this optimal cap fit is actually the one of the most vital components. Use of non-validated outcome measures as well as use of vague subjective hair loss assessment, etc. These all were the attributable things for widely varied success rates in literature. Next, please. So this is the machine, the Paxman scalp cooling system what we used in our study. And prior to scalp cooling, the cooling cap is disconnected from the coolant lines attached to the subject head, so as to cover the entire scalp with the cap. Then the cap is connected to the coolant lines, and powering on the system activates the refrigeration units to decrease the coolant temperature. The total time duration in a standardized setting is the pre-cooling time of at least 30 minutes, entire duration of chemotherapy when we are administering chemo, and a standardized post-cooling time of at least 90 minutes. Next, please. So there is recent data, including in randomized trials from other part of the world, which has shown a success of scalp cooling. A meta-analysis as well as other randomized controlled trials showed that there are positive results of scalp cooling with acceptable tolerance. These are the few trials. Next, please. Uh, the common theme in above studies is that the taxanes were the predominant chemotherapy. Anthracycline was either not used in all these studies or in very few patients. Only the chemotherapy-induced alopecia was measured, and no one has measured the hair regrowth rate, which is also important. The success rate for hair preservation cannot be complete in any of the technique which if we use. But can it affect the hair regrowth rate also is also vital to measure. Next, please. So this was the background of our study, which is randomized controlled trial of scalp cooling for the prevention of chemotherapy-induced alopecia in Tata Memorial Cancer Center, India. And next, please. So, again, it was an investigator-initiated trial, and consecutive women with non-metastatic breast cancer were taken, who were planned for curative intent treatment. And chemotherapy regimen comprised of the standard chemotherapy regimen containing both anthracycline and taxane in sequential fashion, which is our standard default regimen. And trial period was from December 16 to July 18, and women were non-eligible if they are having CTCA alopecia greater than 0 at baseline, or history of prior chemotherapy, or personal history of migraine or cluster or tension headache, because it increases the cold. The cold might precipitate these things, and cold agglutinin disease or cold urticaria. Next, please. So this was a central randomization method, and subject was stratified by sequence of chemotherapy, whether we are using anthracycline first or taxane first, and they were subsequently randomized to scalp cooling versus not scalp cooling in 2:1 randomization. And as per the standard, I have told the 30 minutes prior, we have started scalp cooling, continue during the chemotherapy and post chemotherapy for 90 minutes. Prior to first cycle, study nurse determined the appropriate size cap for each woman because there are three sizes of cap available: large cap, small cap, and very small cap. And this cap was optimally fitted on the participant's head in accordance with the product information recommendations. Next, please. How we assess the method of hair loss. So alopecia grading was carried out clinically, that is by visual inspection method by primary investigator, as well as by objective criteria of photographing patients' scalps in both scalp pooling as well as in control groups. So these assessments were done at baseline before start of each chemotherapy cycle and at primary and secondary efficacy endpoints. Photographs of first 25 subjects who completed at least the first cycle of chemotherapy were obtained at each alopecia assessment, that is 3 weekly. And for subjects enrolled afterwards, it was at primary and secondary endpoints. Photographs were captured from front, back, both sides, and from above. So 5 angles we have taken these photographs so that the alopecia can be captured appropriately and graded appropriately. And also for further validation, there is an independent observer outside the study as well as the subject themselves. They also, evaluated themselves so that we can have a proper validation, and we correlated these outcomes, the assessment from the investigators, reported results. Next, please. So primary endpoint was successful hair preservation, assessed clinically and by review of 5 photographs, and by using CTC version 4 for alopecia assessment, wherein grade 0 was no hair loss, grade 1 less than 50% hair loss, not requiring a wig after completion of 4 cycles or 12 weeks of chemotherapy. And success was defined as grade 0 and 1 alopecia as per the standard, and failure was defined as grade 2 alopecia, that is loss of more than 50% of hair loss requiring the use of a wig, or with a distance we can make out that this subject is having a hair loss. Participant withdrawal after completion of 1 cycle is also taken as treatment failures. Next, please. So this is the alopecia grading in pictorial way. So we can see that grade 0 there is no hair loss, grade 1 there is less than 50% of loss, while more than 50% loss, which is at a distance you can make out this person is having a hair loss. And so this was considered as grade 2. Next, please. So the secondary endpoints for hair regrowth assessment, and first time in the all these studies which was conducted in Western world, no one has actually assessed the hair regrowth rate. In our study, we have first time assessed the hair regrowth rate also at 6 to 12 months, and it is defined as attainment of grade 0 or 1 alopecia post completion of all chemotherapy cycles. Other secondary endpoints were determined by patient-reported symptoms and by scalp examination and tolerance to scalp cooling, and defined as also percentage who could complete all planned cycles using scalp cooling, and patient-reported adverse event like feeling cold, headache, heaviness, etc. They were recorded in the case record forms. Next, please. So other exploratory efficacy secondary endpoints were independent observer and the subject assessment of primary endpoint about the hair preservation, as well as hair regrowth assessment at 6 and 12 weeks by independent observer and the subjects. And these things, as I said before, to further validate the investigator's assessment. Next, please. Apart from this, we have done the quality of life assessment also at the respective time points. So trial amendment was done to include the regimens, but again they all were containing of anthracycline and taxanes. Next, please. So this is the study design. What happened to be, we will discuss this in further details. Next, please. So this is the baseline characteristics for both the groups, and we can see that age, menopausal status, thyroid status, education, regimen sequence, and staging, etc. are well balanced. Next, please. These are the chemotherapy regimen distribution. So they are anthracycline followed by taxane, or taxane followed by anthracycline. Next, please. So at the time of analysis, 56.3% hair preservation rate was found at primary endpoint and scalp pulling arm in comparison to 0% in the control arm. So this is the similar of what we see in our clinical practice, that if we are using anthracycline containing chemotherapy, the patient, they tend to lose their hairs, even many of them even after one, or majority of them after 2 or 3 cycles. So when we assess the primary endpoint after 4 cycles, the majority of the control, all of the control group rather, they have lost their hairs to up to grade 2. That is more than 50% hair loss. So there are patients who still have some hairs on their scalp. It is not completely bald, but if the loss of hairs is more than 50%, it will come into grade 2, which is considered as uh, you know uh, loss of hair preservation. Next, please. The effect of dust sequencing, very, very important. That patient who received taxane first, 77% of those patients could have successful hair preservation, while those who received anthracycline first, only 33% had successful hair preservation. So this difference was statistically significant, and we must remember to counsel a patient appropriately, because the expectation should be real. So if we are using taxane first, there are high chances that after 4 cycles of chemotherapy, they will be having preservation of hairs. While if we using anthracycline first, there are chances which are only 1/3, and this is in sync with the world literature as well, that taxane, there is high preservation rate in comparison to anthracycline. So this is the picture which is showing at baseline and primary endpoint of the patient who at baseline and primary endpoint, you can see the striking difference, the hair preservation in scalp pool patient in comparison to the control patient, which is almost, uh, almost bald at the 4 cycles primary endpoint assessment. Next, please. About the hair regrowth rate, which was the novel criteria in this trial. So hair growth rate was also significantly better in scalp pulling group, and hair growth rate at 6 weeks is around 89% in scalp pulling arm in comparison to 12% in control arm. Again, we use the same pictorial criteria of achieving grade 0 or 1 hair, hair alopecia kind of grading based on CDCA criteria. And here regrowth at 12 weeks was 100% in scalp pulling versus 59% in control arm. So achievement, so hair regrowth rate is important, because if patient develop a normal hair density as early as possible, they will go towards their normal life after completion of chemotherapy. Next, please. So this is the hair regrowth rate in scalp pooled and control patients. Again, you can see the striking difference in the pictures. Next, please. So this is the primary endpoint with respect to alopecia prevention. This is the success rate, which is based on the PI assessment as well as independent observer assessment and subject assessment. So they all were significantly different in scalp pulling versus non-pulling arm, and there's a good correlation as well. Next, please. So the concordance rate with PI and independent observer with regard to successful hair preservation was 0.914 at primary endpoint and 0.858 at 6 weeks. The PI and subject concordance rate was 0.75 at PEP and 0.85 at 6 weeks. There was compulsion to use head covers or wigs by 46% of the patients who received scalp pulling, and 100% of the patients who were not receiving the scalp pulling. So these all suggest that there is a high success rate with scalp pulling. Next, please. This is just what we have discussed again. Next, please. About the quality of life, so 1 up to 5 quality of life measures were significantly better in scalp pulling group at the time of primary endpoint as well as the secondary endpoint. So the loss of hair reported in the scalp pulling arm was 45% versus 21%, and in the control arm it was 82% at PEP and 53% at secondary endpoint. Next, please. The very important factor that about the adverse events, it was very well tolerated. Initially, when we were proposing this trial, there were a lot of concern about the tolerance, because the scalp will be cooled down to low temperature. So how would be the tolerance in in India, wherein the climatic difference is quite a lot? It's considered as a hot country, so how the patient will take it? But the patient tolerated really well, and there was no grade 3, 4 adverse events. They were grade 1 or 2 side effects, which were majority of the women had grade 1, like 57%. and 12% had grade 2 adverse event in the form of headache or feeling cold, but it was otherwise well tolerated. And some women feel heaviness and some abnormal cold sensation. That's all, but there was no cold-related injury also, which we noted. So it was pretty safe if we take all the precautions and do it in a controlled environment. Next, please. So this study suggests that women with breast cancer who received scalp cooling with both anthracycline and taxane chemotherapy were significantly more likely, that is 57% versus 0%, to have successful hair preservation than those who did not receive scalp cooling. And this is consistent with the results from recent studies which show success of scalp cooling in 30 to 80% of the patients. Next, please. The other important finding for the study is that the study included locally advanced breast cancer patients, which was not the case in other studies. This result indicates that scalp cooling is more effective in women who received taxane followed by anthracycline in comparison to the reverse sequence. If you measure the growth rate at 4 cycles or after 12 weeks, and the similar trend have been observed in other studies as well. It was noted that patients who were started on anthracycline having a high chance of losing hair at the primary endpoint, that is after 4 cycles. However, very interestingly, these patients then regrow their hairs during taxane therapy, and majority resume their normal hair density at the end of chemotherapy or within 6 weeks, thus facilitating the resumption of their normal lifestyle. So it was overwhelming, and it was to see that these patients who were still yet not completed the chemotherapy, they were still on taxane, they started showing those baby hairs in the scalp, and towards the end of the chemotherapy, they are having a good hair density. Next, please. So clinical implication of differential hair preservation potential of different chemotherapies. So practically, if you say in HER2 positive breast cancer, the choice of regimen for early breast cancer may bank towards the TCH regimen that consists of docetaxel, carboplatin, and trastuzumab, rather than doxorubicin and cyclophosphamide followed by taxane and trastuzumab, owing to its superior hair preservation potential. Another important factor would be cost. So currently, scalp cooling devices in India, the cost about in Indian rupees 1,500 to 5,000. That is in US dollar 50 to 75 dollars per chemotherapy cycles per patient, and they are yet not reimbursed by health insurance. So this is also one of the factors which we should consider. And this reimbursement issue is prevailing the world over. It is not only the Indian problem, also the infrastructure limitation. So because, as I said, that pre-cooling time, chemotherapy time, and post-cooling time. So this pre-cooling and post-cooling, there will be additional time, pre-cooling 30 minutes and 90 minutes at least post-cooling. So that increased in time taken to complete one chemotherapy cycles. So in high load centers like ours or others, this is also one of the factors which should be considered, and there should be optimum place which should be capped for these patients. So among women with non-metastatic breast cancer, those who underwent scalp cooling, they were significantly more likely to have less than 50% hair loss after the 4th chemotherapy cycle in comparison to those who received no scalp cooling, and it merits wider application. Next, please. The limitation is that this was a single center study with a relatively small sample, and also the hair preservation rate for assessed after 4 cycles of chemotherapy, which could be different when if we assess the efficacy at the end of all the cycles. But this was the standard. This was the standard in all other studies as well. And majority of the women attained grade 2 alopecia after one or two cycles of A containing chemotherapy that we see in clinics. So when we assess after 4 cycles, it should be considered standard. In the randomized controlled trial by Nangia et al., also they assessed in similar time the hair preservation. The sequence and technicality related with optimum capit are potential confounders for real world outcome. Next, please. So this is the conclusion. So my last slide, that this Paxman scalp cooling system has proven effective in our real world practice, and the best effects are with taxane-based chemotherapy, while the results are modest with anthracycline. So if you start with anthracycline, patients should be warned that their hair preservation is expected in 30% only. So the expectation should be real. However, we should also assure them by telling that, while they were on next taxane phase, their hairs, there are high chances that their regrowth rate, their regrowth start and the regrowth rate is much faster than if they will not use scalp cooling. And by completion of, at the time of completion, perhaps they will regain the normal density, or at least by 6 weeks they will regain the normal density. Treatment was safe and well tolerated, so safety is not a concern. And the staff training and adequate cap size is critical. Optimum cap fitting is a must and must be emphasized, and the training sessions for the staff has to be carried out. So way forward perhaps would be a personalized caps wherein we can really ensure a snug cap fit. That would be my dream, and let's see when it will come true. So with this I will end. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you.
It's so wonderful to see this patients. Have you tried the ovarian malignancy patients which is taxane and carboplatin?
So, ma'am, for this trial, we wanted to use. So now we have actually made the administration, the codings, everything. So now it is open for all the patients. We have started using, and the COVID has stepped in. So since then we have not used, because it is not. There is a chance for other patients to use the same cap. But
these centers in India have been able to start this because it's looking at reassuring situations.
I think many centers, they are, and every.
Share the slides, please. Next slide, please. So basically, I've been asked to talk on the management of anemia and cancer, and I'll just take you through the short incidence, the causes, pathophysiology, and management. Next slide. So what is important is if you look at across the baseline, the incidence of anemia at baseline is close to 30 to 40%, and in cancers like gynecological cancers and hematological cancers, it's almost half these patients have anemia at baseline. So that's next slide, please. So that's a very important factor, because it is seen that those who have severe anemia are also the ones who have a poor performance status, and both anemia and poor performance status has a bearing on the overall outcome of the patient as well as treatment outcomes for these patients. We clearly know, at least in gynecological cancers, that those who are on concomitant chemoradiation and whose hemoglobin is less than 10 in cervical cancers is associated with poor outcomes. And similar is the case with other cancers. Next slide, please. And what is very interesting from this European study is that even there, almost a third of patients who had anemia. Now here, anemia is any degree of anemia, which is hemoglobin less than 12. Of course, mild to moderate is between 10 to 12. That any degree of anemia, only about a third of these patients ever received anemia-directed therapy. And this is more so in patients who had mild to moderate anemia. So that is either hemoglobin between 10 to 12, we are so focused on hemoglobin being more than 8 to just deliver chemotherapy that we forget to assess especially mild forms of anemia, which is hemoglobin between 10 to 12 or moderate between hemoglobin between 8 to 10. So that is the subgroup of patients where we really need to focus and also look at and find out what are the causes of anemia. Next slide, please. Okay, I think we are all familiar with the pathophysiology of anemia, and especially in cancer patients, it's also related to anemia of chronic disease. And this is mainly because there is a functional deficiency of iron because of hepcidin, which is produced by the tumor and also through interleukin 6. So that is the interleukin 6 causes the liver to produce hepcidin, and this causes a functional deficiency of iron. Next slide, please. And it is also known that the cancer-related anemia is related to poor nutritional status, pro-inflammatory state, and this is a vicious cycle where the poor nutritional status again aggravates cancer-related anemia because it's a pro-inflammatory state. So it's a vicious cycle which we need to break. Next slide, please. So important to remember in our context is that, of course, apart from anemia of chronic disease, that is the cancer-related anemia which is prevalent in our patients, another very important factor is nutritional deficiency, and even like from an Indian study that almost about 48% of patients at baseline, even in hematolymphoid, had nutritional anemia. So almost about 40 to 50% of our patients having anemia, the cause is nutritional. Of course, there are other causes like hemolysis, blood loss, marrow infiltration, and of course, chemotherapy or radiotherapy, especially when it involves more than 20% of the bone marrow. Next slide, please. So therefore, it is important that when these patients of anemia, they come to us, it is important that we do a complete evaluation. Of course, when we're looking at hematolymphoid malignancies, we do a peripheral smear. But it is equally important when we are treating like patients with solid tumors who have received multiple lines of chemotherapy and they're coming to us repeatedly with anemia and low counts to look at their peripheral smear, both to look at in some patients like breast cancer with marrow infiltration or whether they have developed a secondary MDS. And as I mentioned, what is most important in our set of patients, first rule out a nutritional cause of anemia. So that is to get an serum iron, TIBC, ferritin, B12, folate. So I think that, and of course look at the serum creatinine in GFR. So what we sometimes miss out is, grade 1 or 2 CKD, especially in an older patient, 65, 70, your creatinine is 1. Important to calculate the GFR because they would be having an underlying early CKD, which could also be contributing to the anemia. And of course, other causes like hemolysis is something that we need to remember. So once we have decided what the cause of anemia is, I think we need to focus on how to treat. And of course, we know that some of the chemotherapy agents cause anemia, and cancer itself at many sites is associated with blood loss and iron deficiency. Of course, B12 and folate deficiency we need to supplement. In case of iron deficiency anemia, the question always comes as what form of iron should we be giving them? Is it an oral iron or is it an IV iron that we need to give? So this was a very nice study conducted at TMCH by Dr. Vanita, which compared IV iron with oral iron, and the mean hemoglobin of these patients was around 10. And if you look at the hemoglobin rise at 6 weeks, which was more than 1 gram, about 20% of these patients had a rise in hemoglobin to more than 1 gram, irrespective of whether it was supplemented by IV or oral. Now you might wonder that even after supplementing by IV, why was the rise, a 1 gram rise at 6 weeks so low at only about 20% of these patients, because these patients were also receiving concomitant chemotherapy. So that is probably the reason. But important thing it came out is that even though they were on chemotherapy, there was no difference between the IV and the oral. And most of us have this that IV is probably more well tolerated and would give rise to a faster rise in hemoglobin. Next slide, please. And even interestingly, the most common side effect of oral iron is GI toxicity. And almost about 40% of these patients had GI toxicity. But interestingly, it was no different with the IV iron as well. So both the IV and the oral were associated with similar degrees of GI toxicity. In another study, of course, by Orbeck, that had shown a higher rise with IV iron, but that was associated with the use of erythropoietin, whereas here, as we will subsequently see, we did not use erythropoietin. Next slide, please. So now coming to erythropoietin stimulating agents. So what is most important is that these erythropoietin stimulating agents should only be used in patients who are being treated with a palliative intent. So it is chemotherapy associated anemia, palliative intent, hemoglobin less than 10. And the reason for this is that, even in a large randomized study where of metastatic breast cancer, where almost 2,000 patients, were treated with either ESA or best supportive care, other treatments, it was shown that it did not meet non-inferiority, meaning that ESA was associated with a higher risk of death. So higher risk of immediate death was associated mainly because of the increased risk of thromboembolic events and also increased short-term mortality and decreased overall survival. Another hypothesis being the presence of ESA-like receptors even on the cancer cells, and that is the reason why we have to really weigh the harms and the benefit. So it is only in patients who are like palliative intent, and that too after third or fourth line, who are requiring maybe repeated transfusions, hemoglobin is less than 10, and we want to reduce the transfusion requirement. So that is probably the only area where we could consider. And of course, as it is mentioned, that just giving a plain RBC transfusion is also an option in these patients. Next slide. So I would just want to conclude by the fact that one is recognize the presence of anemia, especially mild anemia. Look at the cause. Rule out nutritional and specifically iron deficiency, but B12 and folate are equally common. Another important is that one should IV and oral iron are almost equally efficacious, and ESA only in the palliative setting. So, and that too in patients, and we really need to weigh the risks and benefits. Thank you. Thank you. Hello. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. So were you able to hear? I couldn't figure out whether it was completed or not.
Yeah, Dr. Jaya, it was good. We heard it nicely.
No, because I don't know. Suddenly I realized that the speaker is off, so I didn't know whether you heard it or not.
Yeah, we heard it. Lovely it was.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaya. It was lovely. And do you want to give a take-home message that how in clinics, especially for some students or fellows who are part of the today's audience, what should be the take-home message for anemia management in oncology?
So I think anemia management in oncology, rule out nutritional anemia is the bottom line that I would want to say. First, recognize anemia, because do a peripheral smear, the very basics, do a clinical exam, peripheral smear, rule out nutritional anemia. That's the bottom line that I would want to say.
Thank you. Over to the chairpersons.
Good evening. I am Dr. Advani, and it is my pleasant duty to introduce Dr. Anita Ramesh. She has been our friend for really many 20-30 years now, and at present she is the head of the Department of Medical Oncology at Savita Medical College, Savita University, and she is going to now give her presentation. Dr. Anita.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. It was nice to see you. Nice to see Jyoti and Jaya and all my friends from Mumbai and other parts of India. So this coronavirus has brought us all together in the digital platform. Okay, but then I'm now, you got used to webinars, I don't know in future whether I'll travel or not, but I enjoy doing the webinars. Okay, thank you. Can sir, who is going to introduce the panelist?
I think you can introduce.
Okay, I'll call my panelists then. Okay, Prabhat Bhargav, Dr. Chandigarh. Can we start?
Yeah.
Treating on few drugs, not the entire neutropenia. Okay, let's get started. So today we'll focus our discussion on this granulocyte macrophage colony stimulating factor, or GM-CSF, and the M-CSF. Now quickly to the panelists, how will you approach to a patient of neutropenia? in your regular practice? How do you go about after giving the, how do you manage a patient?
Yeah. So,
open common question.
Yeah. So first, as the guideline says that we have to take the whatever the regimen we are giving, what is the potential of doing neutropenia in that regimen. Not only that, we have to check the patient performance status, his or her comorbidities, and so these things we have to consider. So definitely, first thing is that how is the potential of that regimen of doing creating neutropenia. So that there are three categories: high, intermediate, and low. We all know that. So we have to divide that, and we have to see the age of the patient, performance status over and above that regimen. So we'll choose according to that whether to give primary prophylaxis to that patient or not.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pradeep. Anybody else wants to add? And having what he has said perfectly is what we do. Anything anybody wants to add before we move on to the next part?
I think if a patient with neutropenia, then you have to consider two things: the chemotherapy and the use of previous primary prophylaxis and the present situation. Present situation is by MSCC risk factor, but the patient is going to require the oral antibiotic or IV antibiotic. Patient is stable it or not, depending on that. So the chemotherapy, primary prophylaxis, and patient factors, these are the three things we need to look for.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Both of you are exactly right on the dot. Okay, very important is subsequent cycles, whether the patient has developed neutropenia, not neutropenia, and how do you proceed. And these are the key, all our panelists has told us, and the risk stratification, and it is a very, very important decision in treatment, because when we particularly go for adjuvant, we should not miss the patient for febrile neutropenia, and in all our centers, this rate should be very low. Now, coming to the quick question to all the panelists, before we move on to toxicity, see this slide, the use of GCSF recommended, not only NCC and all guidelines. So in your practice, what is your choice of the growth factors you use, and prophylactically how you use? Any one of the panelists?
So myself, we are commonly using that filgrastim, and we commonly choose because it's cheap, and so commonly we use filgrastim at the dose of 5 microgram per kg body weight. We can use from the after 24 hours or even after 3 days post chemotherapy. So even we can choose pegfilgrastim also. So commonly we choose because pegfilgrastim is also cheaper nowadays. So 6 milligram fixed dose for an adult patient we can choose, or 100 microgram per kg. If it is, I usually don't give pegfilgrastim less than 6 years old, but if it is a child and more than 6 years, then we can give 100 microgram per kg body weight after 12 hours, from 12 hours post chemotherapy.
Yes. Okay. Anybody else who has not spoken among the panelists wants to tell something before we use? All of you use GCSF. How many people use GMCSF? Dr. Ritu is there? Dr. Prabhat?
Yes, ma'am. We normally use GCSF only, and very frequently use PEG GCSF.
GMCSF.
GMCSF we have hardly used.
Okay, fine. And Dr. Neeraj is there? Okay. Dr. Neeraj? Okay. Now let's move on to the toxicities. Now all of us have said that we get these type of toxicities with the, okay, what is the common toxicity that you see when you give this PEG GCSF or you give the simple filgrastim? And one of the panelists already, doctors told us that it is, we use the generics. So commonly toxicities encountered in these cases.
So commonly we are facing that flu-like reaction, and most important is patient usually complaints of back pain. So that is the two most common side effects I usually encounter, and I heard from our patients.
Yeah, Dr. Prabhat. You said rarely you use sargramostim. Any experience with the use of sargramostim?
Not much, just rarely we have used.
Yeah. Anybody else in the panel or in the audience, or rather the viewers, have used the sargramostim? Okay, fine. Let's move on to it. Correctly, the doctor, you have told, usually most common is this bone pain. We did have some patient coming back for admission for bone pains also. Apart from this few allergic reaction, sometimes these are rare side effects which has been documented, but be very careful if the patient has immunogenicity or has vasculitis. Now, today we wanted to restrict our discussion to the use of GM-CSF or MCSF. So this sargramostim, you avoid using if there is a cardiac, hepatic, renal, but that goes with all drugs. It's not that this drug has to be done. And it does also cause some flu-like reaction. It causes some myalgia and some diarrhea, skin rashes, okay, but then they are all manageable toxicity. Okay, now nobody has used this drug. That's what you say, but I have just started using this drug, and the drug it's mainly used for the allogenic and the allogenic transplant as well as the autologous transplant, and it can be used along with the filgrastim and also the Perisector, which is used for mobilization of the cells into the periphery prior to the harvest. Okay, and it is also used mainly in this scenario: autologous, allogenic, stem cell transplant, mobilization. It is also used for as a prophylactic dose after AML induction in acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It's also used in myeloma. And also in the post-autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So let's see some of the, if you see the NCCN guidelines, the use of the GM-CSF, you can give it along with filgrastim as well. Filgrastim and sargramostim can be given together. Quick words from the thought process. Do you think any scenario you would like to use this drug? Because if you see the guidelines, it is already there. Okay, and any thought process from the doctors, whether you want to use concurrent or whether you want to use the single agent, where will you use?
I think the real value for sargramostim is the transplant mobilization, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
The other use I can say, if the patient is having thrombocytopenia to GCS or PEG-GCS previously, then I can switch to sargramostim in a non-transplant setting. So the standard is for transplant is the sargramostim is a better options. Non-transplant should be GCSF or PEG-GCSF.
Okay, so we want to restrict it completely to the mobilization of the hematopoietic progenitor cells in an autologous. But if you see the present guidelines 2020, leukemia, okay, who did not receive prophylactic GCSF in the first cycle, the MGCSF or the myeloid growth factor is an indication, particularly when there is infected, complicated, or infection-associated complication. So again, quick opinion from our panelist. What is your thought process in this? This is there in the guidelines as, I think, category 1. And also it is used in hematopoietic acute radiation syndrome. This is an approved drug provided you were not exposed earlier and you had infection complications of febrile neutropenia. Okay, anybody wants to take before we move? What about Dr. Chandan Krishnadas?
If he's already received no prophylactic GCSF, then I would go for the standard GCSF, which would be a daily version. If it uses pegylated GCSF, sometimes tends to use also in patient is deteriorating, I want to supplement with standard GCSF also. But previous pegylated GCSF, the GCSF levels are quite high if you measure actually. Actually, there is no need of giving GCSF after the around 7 to 10 days after pegylated GCSF.
Yes.
Though in our routine practice, we take to give active.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, exactly. That's one of the very important point. If you give a PEG GCSF, you don't need to give the other filgrastim, but then we give it when the patient gets admitted because but that's not in the recommendation. So the NCCN recommends the evaluation of risk factor, the infection-related complication, particularly if you're elderly, if your ANC is low, you had a prolonged neutropenia, you have a pneumonia, you had evidence of fungal infection, had hospitalization earlier. This is a particular scenario. Apart from the hematological malignancies where you use it for mobilizing the marrow, this drug GM-CSF and the GM-CSF or sarcomustine has been approved in the guidelines to be used in cases of solid tumors. So we heard about our experience. Everybody said that there is minimum experience. I have just started using 1 or 2 patients recently for this indication. Now, do anybody wants to say something about this drug before we move on to the, because febrile neutropenia is a common discussion we regularly have with antibiotics, growth factors. So this is the different angle to the discussion, and we thought we'd have some thought process how to go about, because the drug is on the recommended panel. And how today's discussion is basically to see how we can extrapolate the recommendation and use in our Indian practice. Are we doing it? What are the hurdles? And how to go forward? Quick comment from the panelists before we move to the anemia and cancer.
So the sarcomustine, this drug GM-CSF, I have seen that it is little. It's scary that it has lots of side effects apart from the common group side effects of GCSF or GCSF. Even there are some hypertension, even hypotension, lots of other side effects, fluid retention, cardiac, even. So we have to use very cautiously these drugs. I think in hospital setting, definitely we can use that. But if we use in an OPD basis, I think that will be difficult. Because what about the side effects I see?
Yes, Dr. Pradeep, it is very well taken, and I think it's a good thought process. May not be able to use as an OP basis with the side effects. So let's summarize. It has been approved, particularly in high risk febrile neutropenia, when patient having the risk factors which I just pointed out, that is the myeloid growth factor. It can be GM-CSF or GCSF, can be used to treat, and this is the HARS is the hemopietic AR, that respiratory distress syndrome, where there's lot of cytokines released into the individual. It has been approved, and it causes mild myalgia, it causes facial puffing, it may cause fever, headache, nausea, and dyspnea, and is commonly administered in hematological transplant setting, either to mobilize or as a supportive care or as post-transplant. FDA has approved the biosimilars. And NCCN, that's the indication, which is the last slide in this half, where elderly patient with sepsis, prolonged admission, neutropenia, the GM-CSF should be considered, where the myeloid growth factor comes into the play, and this drug has an approval as on 2020. So that's fine. We move forward because we need to know how the people take it. Few references are there in myeloid leukemia and the bone marrow transplant. Now, quick question to the panelists. Did the other panelists, Dr. Neeraj, Dr. Ritu, joined? How do you approach to a patient with anemia and cancer? If not, the other panelists can take the question, please.
As Jack ma'am has already alluded to, first of all, I would like to rule out the nutritional deficiencies. And if it is not, then it will be a chronic anemia of chronic disease, or else if it is post-chemotherapy, then it will attribute to be related to chemotherapy. And then accordingly treat it.
Yeah, definitely routine anemia of chronic disease has to be ruled out, like if there is any hemolysis, any nutritional deficiency, inherited renal dysfunction, and chemo, radiation, myelosuppression, hormone dysfunction, other evidence of chronic. Okay, so it's not so easy to manage this chemotherapy-induced anemia, and we have to give a holistic approach to them. Quick question back to the panelists. Doctors, when do you consider your patient for transfusion post chemotherapy coming with anemia?
So there is no hemoglobin cutoff for me at least to transfuse patient. So I have to see patient. I have to consider everything. Means what is the age of the patient, what is the comorbidities along with that anemia, what is the regimen, and what is the means expectation that how much anemic she will be when we start the chemotherapy. So everything I have to consider, and then so there is no cutoff for anemia, but most of the patients who are getting routine chemotherapy, I try to is that when the hemoglobin is less than 7, then I transfuse. But I also consider that comorbidities and other organ dysfunction before the transfusion.
Yeah, Dr. Different thought process, or you will manage it the same way?
The same way, actually. Any patient with symptomatic anemia,
excellent,
and this is the fastest way to achieve get rid of symptoms, the transfusion. So symptomatic anemia is the indication of RBC transfusion. That's
excellent, and that gives you an excellent improvement in the quality of life. That before you discharge, the patient will be like so happy. So quality of life matters. Yes, doctors, symptomatic anemia is very important, and also asymptomatic anemia, but with underlying comorbidities, maybe a cardiac disease, pulmonary, cerebral, uncontrolled tumors. These are the 2 indications. But if your patient is asymptomatic and has no comorbidities, just observe. Now, next question to the panelists, Dr. Prabhat, Dr. Pradeep, and Dr. Chandan. 3 of you. When do you give iron injections?
So my preferred iron supplement is iron injection for absolute iron deficiency, and those patients who use the ESA or the darbepoetin or erythropoietin, they usually require iron deficiency because they tend to develop iron deficiency, which is functional. And NCCN clearly shows absolute iron deficiency and functional iron deficiency. These are the most common indications for IV anemia, IV iron therapy.
Okay. Anybody else wants to answer this?
Yeah. So that transferrin saturation less than 20 is my cutoff, and along with that serum iron less than absolute iron less than 50, and transferrin saturation less than 20% usually. I follow when we give the iron supplementation, and mostly, if possible, we give IV iron supplementation because most of the chemotherapy patients will have nausea, vomiting, and GI toxicity, GI problem. GI upset will be there, so I prefer not to give oral iron.
So when the transferrin saturation is less than 50, and also when the when your iron deficiency, there is no iron deficiency, that is the patients who don't need any, that's in the last group, they don't need any iron transfusion. But anywhere up above, everybody needs some IV iron along with the erythropoietin supplement. Now, which preparation of iron will you use commonly in your practice?
So ferric carboxyl maltose is the commonly used iron preparation. Since my TMH times, I used to say this, and now also I'm practicing giving this ferric carboxyl maltose. And probably I give 500 mg if patient is less than 50 kg weight, and above 50 kg, I will give 1 gram.
Okay. And what is your frequency of repeating the dose?
Yeah. So guidelines saying that you should repeat after 7 days, but most of the patients can't take that so frequently. But I try to repeat in 1 month time if still hemoglobin is
the next chemo.
Yeah.
Okay. Apart from Dr. Pradeep, again back to Dr. Prabhat and Dr. Chandan. Have you used any other preparation apart from the ferric carboxymaltose?
If my patient is isolated pure iron deficiency, sometimes I use isomaltose, the ferric isomaltose, the isofor, only for the pure iron deficiency. But for others, the cancer-associated anemia, iron deficiency, I tend to use carboxymaltose.
Okay. And Dr. Neeraj, I think, has joined. Dr. Neeraj, any thought process from your side?
I am using 1000 per week. And the patient is responding very well.
Okay, responding very well. Okay, Dr. Neeraj, quick question. Now, we have already heard when we are going to give the blood transfusion. Now, what is your cutoff for the erythropoietin stimulating agent? Whom will you use, or will you use along with the iron therapy?
So, after 2 doses, the patient is not responding, then we should think of blood transfusions.
Yeah, my question is the erythropoietin stimulating agent. When will you be using the erythropoietin stimulating agent, ESA?
I am usually using along with iron in severe anemia cases that is below 7, space below 7. I am using along with iron.
Okay. Any other difference in opinion from the other panelists regarding ESA using? Do you use for all patients? Do you use every time with iron? Because we have already seen this chart where only the functional iron deficiency, they are saying to use it with the EPA.
I tend to use ESA or the darbepoetin for the anemia of chronic disease. So if iron is fine, I tend to use singly, but I have to monitor frequently the iron profile because that tends to develop the functional iron. Then I would add actually IV iron of anything.
Otherwise, cutoff dose for ESA is 9 grams per deciliter till 11 grams of deciliter.
Yes, 11 is the standard. So no need to exceed 11 because the chance of the thrombosis hypertension is much higher after 11.
Yeah, you should not cross 11 and between 9 to 11, and correctly our panelist has said, I think Neeraj also said, all of you said that we alongside look for the iron deficiency anemia, if needed supplement with the iron deficiency with the intravenous things. We also did the clinical trial on the iron drugs at India. Few of the references are, these are the study on ferric carboxymaltose and anemia associated with chemotherapy, and side effects are there. Be very careful. This also needs to be most important. Quickly, before I tell, a quick question to the panelist. What are the side effects that you see with these iron injections, and how careful are you be, and whether you can give it as an OP basis?
Ferric carboxymaltose, I think, is the safest, and I have not experienced any single of any reaction or anaphylaxis with that. So it's the safest preparation, and I prefer that.
Any comments from the other panelists before we wind up for today?
Apart from the allergic or the infusion reaction, the other side effects I must say the hypophosphatemia. But actually phosphate for the any patient with an IV iron. And if you see week 2 or week 3, the maximum chance of peak hypophosphatemia, and it is much higher as compared to the isomaltose.
Yeah, and also one needs to be also careful that we don't get into an iron overload. Okay, look for the kidney, renal parameters, cardiac parameters, because this iron infusion causes ECG changes. But what correctly you have said, most important, an allergic reaction and subsequent doses leads to hypophosphatemia. Now, any other comments that the other panelists wants to make regarding the two drugs, or something which we have left out, or even I request the chairperson and the other speakers to chip in your comments before we wind up for today's case-based discussion.
I think the IV iron or evaluation of anemia is actually less. We actually doing much lesser as compared to others. We should do it more screen for the nutritional anemia, more frequently use of the iron supplement or oral iron, so that we actually improve the quality of life of cancer.
Correct. Yeah, I do agree with you, Dr. Chandan. It's a very important take-home message. We in our busy practice sometimes overlook the anemia. We are more interested in how to push the chemo drugs, but then this, what you said, is very important. The quality of life improves. Please keep supplementary iron. Oral preparation may be difficult because of mucositis and lower absorption, but definitely intravenous iron can be included into the chemotherapy schedule and repeated once in 3 weeks when we are giving. The once in a week may be difficult, and I rightly agree with you. It should be taken into control. And thanks to Jyoti for organizing supportive care in oncology is something very, very important. If you don't support them with the side effects, they just abandon you and not take the treatment. The entire survival, everything comes down. So if your patient is not reporting to the OPD. So thanks. I also love enjoying supportive care meetings. Thanks to everybody. And I hand it over to the chairperson to give their expert comments. And as I stop sharing my screen, stay healthy, stay safe. We'll meet again. Stay connected.
Thank you, ma'am.